lot of what I'm going to say has already been said better by my friends and colleagues. I was told that the audience is substantially different, but in fact it's not. I can see that most people were here, which is a bit disappointing. So you might actually be exposed to the same thoughts. Okay, so what I want to do here is try to put these things together and try to put them together in a way that maybe give and add a little bits here and there to sort of tell the story of why redistribution is something that deserves maybe more focus than it has had. I think and that in particular that in redistribution in poor countries deserves more focus than this. Poor countries spend much less, and I'll show you numbers, as a fraction of GDP on redistribution. I think there are various ways of measuring it. Rima showed a graph already, so I'll free ride on that. What's maybe worth emphasizing is that that's not just true as a fraction of GDP, it's also true as a fraction of public spending. So they spend less as a fraction of public spending. So so GDP, you might say that okay, maybe they have and it's true that they have less fiscal capacity and all that. This is maybe a more striking fact from Amaury Guettin's paper, and this is true. Also, you can see basically that the poorest countries are clustered in the bottom left. DRC is near the bottom. Ethiopia is near the bottom. France is absolutely at the top. So this is a fact that's actually worth underscoring, is that it's not a matter of money; it's a matter of allocation of money. These are other measures you can find. So there's various different numbers you can use to make the same point. This is social insurance, and here you can the countries are ordered, and you can see the countries. If you can see the names, you probably can't, but at the extreme right are countries like DRC. I'm going to squint. Liberia, Chad, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Nigeria. Those are the extreme right of that. So you can see, and these are only the poor country, LMICs, so low and middle income countries, and you can see the poorest countries spend less on almost every form of social insurance. So that's another related fact. And a third way to look at it is to look at something even narrower. This is social assistance, meaning not just so specifically transfer programs, rather than broader ideas. And again, you can the names of the countries may be eligible, but the poorest ones are the ones that are the smallest. So it's also true that rich countries also have variation. So not all of the variation is just being poor. And because I'm going to mention rich countries as well, you can see that if you take social protection, countries like the US have much less of it than countries like Finland and Denmark. So there's a lots of variation. Those are very large orders of magnitude. Those are so it's not just poor countries. There's variation for other reasons, and I want to come back to that point about why there's so much variation. But I think let's start with the fact that poor countries spend less as a fraction of public spending on social protection. The question I want to ask is, does this make sense? And you could, of course, as I mentioned, there's a fiscal constraint, and if you imagine there are some things that are unavoidable, you might say that already could generate that. So you have to always spend on defense or police or something, and those are fixed costs. And so if you have less money, then you have, I don't necessarily believe that, but but certainly if I start with the most traditional theory of social transfers, which is that social transfers are mostly for income distribution reasons, rather than, for example, a lot of what we discussed all day today, which are the social transfers exist for productivity reasons. So if I think of just the income distribution, poor countries are not less unequal. It depends a bit on how wide the window you take, but it's clear that poor countries are, if anything, more unequal. So that's number one. So if you want to be reducing inequality, then it's relatively obvious that poor countries at least should have more of a demand for redistribution. And if you think that extreme poverty is the goal, the first goal of reducing extreme poverty is the first goal of redistribution, clearly all the extreme poverty in the world is in poor countries. So there is no, prima facie, there is just no way to make the case that this is simply based on the fact that there isn't much to do with the money. Now, on the other side, of course, there is the fiscal constraint. Maybe there are other priorities are less flexible, and the fiscal constraints are very real. I think that's very much. The next graphic is that, also from Amaury's paper. So this one says that if you look at Africa, the fraction of GDP that they have as tax revenues is close to 15%, and France is closer to 50%. So those are big differences, and it's not particularly. It's also the case that most of that comes from indirect taxes. So that additionally makes it harder to use them as a redistributive function, because the indirect taxes in many countries are actually regressive, and even when they're not regressive, they're at best close to linear. And so so therefore, if you try to expand social protection using indirect taxes, you immediately hit the constraint that you're taking from A to give to A. So and you can see that in Western Europe, indirect taxes are much smaller fraction of the total spending. So I think that's already you can see sort of what the unpleasant trade-off is. The unpleasant trade-off is that there isn't, it's harder to squeeze more money out of people without really hurting the poor by doing it. And this is sort of not taking into account the other rather regressive tax that is often used, which is inflation. Now, having said that, it's not the case that people, I'm sort of making it sound like it's obvious that poor countries should redistribute more. They just they can't. But in fact, I was educated at a time when it was considered to be heresy to say that. The view was that poor countries are there's growth and there's redistribution. And it was very much a time when in the 1980s where it was made very clear that there's a simple trade-off. You can either grow or you can redistribute, and you can make your choices. But it made it, and given that growth is more of a priority, obviously, for poor countries, and especially if you think about climate change, it's not obvious that the rich countries need to grow. Indeed, maybe it would be great if they didn't grow. it's heresy again, but I say that. But so that very much the view was that poor countries need to grow, and redistribution is bad for growth. So I think this was and then there was this kind of this parallel narrative, which is sort of encompassed in the idea of the Kuznets curve, which is that and don't worry about it. You'll grow, and then you will get equality in any case, and growth will eventually solve all the problems. There was work at some point. There was a moment when the data seemed to support this view. This is a paper I'm citing from 20 years ago, and there were several actually at the time, finding reduction in inequality was positively correlated with reductions in growth. That's another way to say it, that this is this. So you try to reduce inequality, and the next thing that happens 5 years later is growth goes down. Now, it turns out we actually, Esther and I, for the only time in our lives, actually got into cross-country data. Esther's looking aghast at the fact that I'm revealing this. But in fact, all we did was we found that yes, indeed, reductions in inequality were positively correlated with reductions in growth, but so were increases in inequality. All changes in inequality were seem to be correlated with reductions in growth, suggesting that it was all spurious. That it probably is the case that when countries have distress, the measurement gets worse, so you get more measurement error in times of distress. That would explain this. So I think and I think overall this paper, it's not my favorite of my papers, but it had the salutary effect that it discouraged people from writing such papers. So I think the main point is that what is much more robust as a correlation is the fact that, and more recently I think Daron Acemoglu has worked. I mean, there are many people who work. The cross-sectional fact is much more robust. That more unequal countries grow slower. The causal effect of changing inequality is a harder one. And I'm going to not say anything more about this, but just say, so what do you do when you have this? Well, you go to sort of, maybe that's my bias as a microeconomist. You look at what is it that you can say with the data that's about the underlying causal mechanisms. Why do people say that redistribution is going to be bad for growth? So is there what are those causal mechanisms? Can we say something about it? So first question that I think is sort of the most old-fashioned question is, in some sense you redistribute, people become lazy. And that's a very old obsession. This is a great picture. This is from poor houses in Victorian England, where they really didn't like the idea of giving social support to the poor. So they were actually prominent people, who were in the business of designing how to make life particularly unpleasant for people who are on social support. There was a whole Jeremy Bentham being a famous example of someone who actually wrote pages and pages on how to make life unpleasant for the poor. Okay, so he's a famous figure in some sense in economics. That was what he was doing, and these are the beds, this proposed beds, so that if the beds are sufficiently narrow, you can't really sleep. Maybe you're going to go find a job. That's the working theory. So this is an old obsession. As I think Dean mentioned, there is also very little evidence for it. Very little evidence for the fact that there are income effects on labor supply. This is our old paper with Rima and Ben. These are grays from. These are all from cash transfers. Gray is control, purple is treatment, and if you can see a difference between them, It's and I think that's much more dramatically demonstrated by what Dean said today. So I won't stop here, because I think this is a very well established fact that if anything, labor supply goes up and not down when you give people money. Okay, so that's a good first step in saying that at least we don't need to worry about the poor. I think then there is a more complicated issue, which is there a reason to worry about if you give people welfare, then you have to take it out at some point, if it's targeted, and then therefore is there a discouragement effect of taking it off, when you are. Then that's effectively a tax on people's earnings, because as they get richer, you give them less welfare. That's a tax on people's earnings. Is that a big concern? And I think the consensus of the public finance literature is that I think as Luke said this morning, people seem to be pretty bad at manipulating the margins, thankfully, and maybe partly given the non-transparency of our welfare system. That's a good thing. That makes it a good thing, but it's hard to find the margin. So in any case, maybe this is not a huge concern. When you do it and you look at the high estimates of elasticity for very transparent incentives, the elasticity is 0.15. That's a very high estimate. So if with that you don't still get anywhere, that's not anywhere close to what you need to say that, well, this is a big issue, so we should go to universal transfer. So it's actually, at worst, it happens over a smallish range, and it's even there, the elasticity is small. So it's hard to get particularly worked up about it. There's also other things you can do. You can tie subsidies to working, and then you still have the phase out at the top, but you often at the bottom you have more of an incentive to participate then. And therefore, the people who are at the margin of not working often work in order to have earnings. So overall, it doesn't seem to be a big issue. On the rich, I think this Gabriel probably talked about this on the first day. I'm not going to spend time on it, but it's not the case that there's much or very really any really credible evidence of disincentive effects on their effort. There's lots of evidence of them trying to cheat taxes, and that has to be taken into account, and we need to design better tax systems. But it's not so much about the disincentive effect on labor supply, the fact that it's going to reduce growth. These things seem to me to be not there's some to be very little evidence. So then, given that, we can ask, what do we know about kind of the behavior? Then you can think about, well, what about the reverse? Is it the case that if you give people money, do they become more productive? Does it, instead of becoming lazy? And we already saw a little bit about this claim that maybe they work harder. So then I think there are a number of plausible reasons why this might be the case. The one that Paul discussed at some length today, very eloquent way, was this idea that lumpiness seems to be important. People seem to behave as if the investments are lumpy. I think that was very much they want money to be in large tranches. If you give them monthly money, they go and try to turn it into bigger sums of money by participating in Roscars. So there seems to be evidence that people see their consumption or investments as being lumpy, and that presumably that only matters because they are credit constrained. If you could borrow, you could say, I'll take the money now and I'll pay it down later, but I think there is ample evidence that they are credit constrained, that there's I think a vast amount of evidence suggesting that people are unable to to get you can even at very high interest rates, people are still constrained on how much they can borrow. So I think there's probably a reasonable case for this. And second, it also must require that you can't save at home, because if you could save at home, then you could also just do it by saving up. So I think both of those probably are realistic constraints, and therefore the productivity. But then if you don't make the investment, your productivity stays low. I think, and there the case for redistribution is simple. It can make it easier to make the necessary investment. So it's you get some money that you can invest. There's also a different but also plausible theory that risk is a major discouragement. I think that again, old idea. You're poor. You're close to the margin of starvation. I think it's also the case that precisely because you're poor. This is more my particular current obsession. People tend to be very worried about some form of regret. They worry that if I take my family's hard-earned money and I put it on something and I lose it, it'll be awful. So I think both risk aversion and regret play a major role in that decision. And I think redistribution can encourage risk-taking by providing a fallback, obviously. And indeed, given that, it could even take the form of insurance. You could say that, yes, we'll cover you against bad outcomes, and that's all. Otherwise, then there's a more recent literature which says that poverty is stressful, that you spend lots of time worrying about how to make ends meet, and as a result, you have relatively hard time making long-term plans. And again, redistribution there works by making people, just giving them mental space. You are able to spend your time not obsessed by, how to pay your school fees, but something else. So I think that there is, I think Dean did a wonderful job of telling you about, the whole landscape of transfer programs and what they do. And I think what's very clear from that is that transfer programs kind of durably raise incomes, and that's one of the things that the point he was making is that you can look several years after the people's transfers stop, and you still see effects. So that's certainly a great reassurance. I'll tell you a little bit, just because I was of work that Esther and I did with Dean. It was parallel work, but Dean and I also worked on it together on asset transfers to the very poor. And I think that the reason to talk about it is that it gives a bit more texture to this idea of why these transfers, how they change people's lives. So this is a program that we evaluated many years ago in a group that Dean put together, and different people worked on different countries, and there was the program involved assets, some assets that they chose, often livestock of some kind, some training and some encouragement that and I'll say in a minute why that was important, perhaps, and some temporary cash assistance. The reason why this program is distinctive is that these were literally chosen to be the poorest people in poor communities. The selection mechanism, sometimes implemented better than others, was that these are people who were meant to be not just poor, but people in poor communities where other people said, if you ask them who are the poorest people, they would nominate them. So they were literally meant to be people who are, and in the sample that Esther and I studied, they were literally people who lived mostly by begging. So they really had no career. They were usually women, typically with children, whose husband or partner had either left them or had become an alcoholic or had died. So they were really, and they had been married young, so that really didn't have an opportunity, young meaning at 13 or something, and had opportunity to acquire skills. So this was a group that, if you had to think of somebody for whom, and this cuts both ways. At one level, you could say either that these people had very little human capital. That sort of theory this was under. They needed hand-holding, they needed reassurance. Or you could say the opposite. These people had never tried anything and failed. So they were, in a sense, fresh and able to the selection. You could imagine, if you think that what got them into play was just bad luck, then you could imagine they're not selected against. They were poor, but because they were poor purely because of bad luck. Or you could think that, well, maybe because they had never had a chance to get any skills, they wouldn't be able to do it. So there was an interesting sample to study for that reason. They're both of these forces, and in some sense, to make this case that, even the people who look on paper totally sort of incapable of operating in a market economy might be able to actually surprise you. Across countries is that after, this is between typically after 3 years after the assets were given, these people, and this is after all the temporary 6 months, the first 6 months they got some temporary cash assistance. All of that has stopped. They owned more productive assets. They worked longer hours. They earned more. They were happier and healthier. In the Indian program, we followed them for 10 years. In fact, we're going back right now to see what they are doing after 15 years or 17 years. We can see that these are now treatment and control. Red is control, blue is treatment. At 18 months after the treatment to 10 years after the treatment. And you can see that the gap is, if anything, certainly always positive, quite large, and always 20-25% gap in this one is in consumption, this one is in food security, this one is in income. Okay, so they're doing better. Maybe I want to. This is mostly why it's when I said you can get texture. So it's a durable difference. I don't know whether it'll last forever, but in some sense that's less interesting question, because it's not. It's the interesting question is it the case that I give you one boost and you go a long way with it, and so that raises the rate of return on it. What I want to emphasize quickly, and you probably can see this one, what's interesting is that what they do with the assets is, these are actually, despite what I said about their background and everything else, they're actually dynamic entrepreneurs. At the beginning, their extra income comes from livestock. At 18 months. Between 3 and 7 years, the extra income starts to come from other things, from another business, not livestock, a non-farming business. That's where they starting getting it. So they switch. When they get a chance, they become a little bit richer, but then they actually are able to do something else with. They have money, they can do something else with it, and they do something else with it. So that's the next thing that happens. And finally, by the time they are at the between 7 and 10 years after by that time their children are grown up, and they're using their money to actually send their children further away. They're sending them to further away, and the big income gains are coming from migration. That the children are have a different migration pattern. So in that sense, what I want to emphasize is not just that. What this story is a stand-in for is this idea that these people are actually, they are able to take advantage of opportunities. They're imaginative. They can move. They can take advantage of whatever the market economy is offering, despite the fact that in a sense they started from the absolute worst. They were sort of in the classic classification of economic lives. They were at the very bottom, and that's a encouraging fact, to say the least. And they are still working harder. Okay, just to when you go back to this question of is this efficient to do, and of course efficient for whom? These are still people who are not taxable. So if you think of a purely fiscal return, you give them money, you can't take it back. On the other hand, the rate of returns are, if this 25% increase in consumption happens forever, that's a 1100% return on the money. So if the goal is growth, this is a pretty good investment. And this is as we see this idea that there's a productivity bump from giving money to the poor is now they're probably just there's the long list of studies that Dean studied. They're from all over the world, but also so the transfer programs, but also Dean and Chris Udry have a study where they show that subsidized insurance to farmers has large effects on earnings. Or Mushfiq Mubarak has a study, Gareth Bryan and Mushfiq Mubarak have a study which is basically if you give people a loan to migrate, that increases their earnings and consumption, and all you need to do is guarantee that loan will not have to be repaid if some disaster happens, and that's enough. So even insurance, just subsidized insurance, which sometimes will be costly, but often not, is enough to actually generate productivity bumps. The fact that there's insurance already works suggests that risk aversion or loss aversion is important. Credit constraints are important, I think, given that I think there's a lot of, what Paul showed today suggests that, the lumpiness of the money, the ability to make the right sized investments important. And I think there's independent evidence, including from some work which Dean and I were involved with, Chris Udry, which show in Ghana, showing that when people are given a small bump in, so first that people seem to, the fact that people were given this program, that they got livestock, makes them more productive at doing other forms of work. We got them to produce bags, and they were better at producing bags when they were busier with their other assets. So making people busy doesn't make them less productive. If anything, it makes them more productive. And that's consistent with this view that people are discouraged and depressed, and that when they feel less discouraged and depressed, they can do a lot more. And in a sense, my thought is that we're asking them to do too little and not too much. There is a whole third reason to redistribute, which I think connects very much to what you heard yesterday. But I want to underscore the generality of it. Another reason to redistribute, of course, the classic other reason is that we are often buffeted by choices made for and by others. Trade shocks being the classic example of that. Financial crashes. We've sort of forgotten those a little bit, but no doubt we'll be reminded soon. Some people make a shit ton of money and then screw everyone else. That's the nature of financial crashes. It's a popular sport in the US in particular. Climate change, of course. If this is from Otter, Dunn and Hansen from the US, and it's on trade shocks. It's on what they call the China shock, which is basically what this graphic shows is that industries where once China is into WTO, so that China can sell as much as it wants, the good China is good. If you take the industries in the US which produce the goods that China is good at selling to the world, those industries crash. And in fact, this effect explains 60% of the decline in US manufacturing. So this is not a small effect. More importantly, and what's not in this graphic, and you can see there's nothing that's happening to non-manufacturing, is that this is extremely concentrated. Geographically, some places get completely killed, and most of the US, of course, benefits from the fact that cheaper imports are coming in, that consumption is easier. And in a sense, this is very much the nature of trade shocks. In particular, most people benefit from a bit more free trade, and a few people get clobbered. That's the nature of trade shocks. We have a justification for it in economics, which is called redistribution. This is on US has a program for it. It's called the Trade Adjustment Allowance. It's meant to go to places where trade has had bad shocks. It's the amount that for $1,000 per worker increase in imports hurt worker earnings by $549. The trade adjustment allowance paid $3.45 to them. So in other words, redistribution is meant to be so going back to my original theme, even in rich countries, they don't redistribute nearly as much as they need to, and that's a huge part of why I think the political challenges of redistributing are what they are. So that's what I want to come to finish on. So why don't countries redistribute more? And let's for a minute park the fiscal constraints, because this is, as I said, this is the particular issues are not necessarily for poor countries. The US redistributes very little, and especially, unless you count is redistributing through education and mostly through healthcare. The US, your assessment of the US redistribution depends very much on your assessment of healthcare. Healthcare in the US is extremely expensive, and therefore the fact that the poor can have access to it has huge effects on the extent of redistribution. Whether that's the question is the pricing of healthcare reflect as the social cost or not? That's a hard question to resolve. So if you think it does, then the US actually redistributes a lot, almost entirely through healthcare. If you think it doesn't, then it doesn't redistribute much at all. Now, so one reason, of course, is our friend is an example, and it's one reason why you don't redistribute is people are voting is multi-dimensional. You vote on many things, and including some of the things that some people vote just to restrict women's rights to abortion, and they don't actually care about anything else. And so that particular combination will generate often, it will undermine redistribution. Another reason is that voters actually, much more than economists, believe that taxes are redistributing. So this is a good example. The column, the economists are in the first column. The second column are the average American. This is a representative sample. And you can see that the people who believe in the Laffer curve, that you cut taxes, tax collection will go up. They're almost, because as soon as you cut taxes, people will work harder and all that. No economist believes in it. This is a panel, kind of a panel of leading economists that is organized by the University of Chicago, not a particularly a communist list. And you can see that the people who, economists, 90% of the economists think this is bullshit. But the world believes in it. That's very interesting. It's part of we planted this story. Milton Friedman did us a favor of planting this story very effectively. Ronald Reagan was his friend, and they advertised it, and people believe it, and believe it so much that they really don't like taxes. Poor people especially. Even though this is something, a work Esther and I did with Stephanie Sancheva. So we asked people, but basically the exercise is very simple. We asked people, if I make it easier for you to not work in some form or the other, many different versions, what would you do? And people, and then we asked people, otherwise, if we make it easier for other people to not work, what would they do? So people's theory is, I won't change my behavior. I'm going to continue to work, but everyone else will stop working. So it's even more interesting in a sense, the way people have absorbed this message. A third reason why you don't redistribute is trust in governments. Trust in governments is low in many countries, and it's low. There are countries where it's not, but if you can pick your favorite country, you can see that, in the United Kingdom, it's the answer to the question is 30%. The U.S. is a bit higher, but Americans are very nationalist. France is between the U.S. and U.K. So you can see that it's very low. It's less than 50% in many of the countries we are interested in. So and that of course is very important, because it means that redistribution is always going to be a policy that, especially insurance, is a policy that mostly works when bad things happen. And most people, when they're thinking of insurance types of programs especially, they're thinking, well, will they deliver when it happens to me? And if you don't believe that, then it's very hard to implement these programs. And that's a generic problem. Think of climate change, all the shocks. If you don't believe in your government, then it's very hard to imagine you're being able to implement, get people to support it, because they will say that, yes, in the end you're lying. Just you're going to give it to your friends or whatever. And there's a fair degree of racism at least in this conversation as well. You give it to the particular minority of your choice. This is in the U.S. The trust in government is declining. No, in UK it's declining, and they haven't actually measured it now. If you look in the UK now, they might not find it on this graph. Now, I want to say that this is connecting back, and I'm done. So I was connecting back to what I said about redistribution. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that in the end, people felt that this government has cheated them. That when it came to the trade shock, that they didn't get it. The money, didn't come. They were told that trade will be great for everybody, NAFTA would be great for everybody, WTO would be great for everybody, and then they know people, maybe not them, but they know people who got screwed by it, and the government didn't act. And I think that's the same challenge that you will the older among you will recognize. This is a few years ago now, but just a few. The Gilets jaunes were complaining about taxes on carbon taxes, and their complaint was exactly that, which is that you will pay the taxes, and then that you will use that money to help the rich. And in fact, it didn't help that this was combined with a cut in wealth taxes or elimination of wealth taxes, I think. So it was not. This is not a. So I think people see the reason why they don't trust the government is because the government doesn't believe to work in trustworthy ways, I must say, partly at least. So that's all. That's my. I guess I feel that we're in a place where at this point our challenge is even bigger. With climate change, we really have to think of cross-border redistribution. And these narratives about how redistribution reduces growth and redistribution the money just vanishes and people become lazy, and that and then on the other side that the money never shows up, the money only goes to the friends of the government. All of those narratives are extremely damaging. If we want to actually deal with climate change, where we really need to be able to make credible promises or long-term credible promises of compensation, we really need to change this discourse, the discourse about how redistribution is pernicious or worse. And I really think that the evidence is completely transparently on the other side. I don't have any. I know we are supposed to be. Economics are supposed to be two-handed. We always say, on the other hand. I want to not say on the other hand. I'm going to say, on both hands, redistribution, we need more, and we need to do it better, and to convince people that it can be done better. I'll stop there.